Welcome to At Issue. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the new year here at WTVP. My name is H. Wayne Wilson, and there's a lot happening in Washington, D.C., or a lot to happen in 2018. That includes stopgap funding. It includes, we're going to talk about tax reform that just occurred. We'll talk about a lot of issues with the Congressman for the 18th Congressional District. He is Darren LaHood. Darren, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your being here.
Thanks, H. Great to be with you and your viewers. Happy New Year.
Thank you, and the same to you. And just to make sure people understand the geographic boundaries, the 18th District is?
18th District includes all or parts of 19 counties in central and west central Illinois, so part of Peoria, and then we go to Bloomington Normal, Springfield, Jacksonville, Illinois, Quincy, Macomb, and all places in between.
And you share Peoria with Congresswoman Bustos.
I do, yeah. Essentially, the dividing line in Peoria is War Memorial Drive. So if you live south of War Memorial, you're in Congresswoman Bustos' district. If you live north of War Memorial, you're in our congressional district.
Would it be fair to say that tax reform was the crown jewel of 2017 for Congress?
I would say, yeah. It was, an important issue that we talked about when the president ran and when we ran for Congress, and I talked about that. And I think in the end, it will be the signature piece of legislation we passed for 2017.
And there are a lot of people who talk about the cost of the tax reform, and I want to reflect back. We have a soundbite from last August 24th when you were last on At Issue. Let's take a look and listen to that and see what the congressman had to say back in August.
You have to pay for tax cuts when you're $20 trillion in debt. How do you do that? So our proposal, somewhat controversial, is called the BAT tax, B-A-T tax, which essentially says if you were a net exporter out of the United States, you're not going to pay that BAT tax. But if you are a company like Walmart that produces a lot of products in other countries and bring them back into the U.S. to sell at Sam's or Super Walmart, you're going to pay what's called a BAT tax, a 20% tax to bring those products in.
Two things out of that. Did you want to respond to that? Because it's a little bit different than what actually happened.
Yeah, so the BAT tax was somewhat controversial at the time. I was very supportive of it. It was a provision that was not included in the final bill that we voted on. But the package that we ended up voting on is good for our district in central and west central Illinois, and I think it's good for the economy. What I said throughout tax reform is how do we get the economy thriving again, healthy again, robust? If you look at the last 8 years, our growth rate was never over 1.5, 1.6%. Well, we cannot sustain ourselves in terms of what we need to spend money on, whether that's infrastructure, education, research. And so our plan was, how do we pass a tax bill that gets the economy going again? So we talked to business owners, we talked to farmers, we talked to small, medium, large companies. What do we need to put in a tax reform bill? And what people told us is you got to bring down the tax rate. We have the highest highest tax rate for corporations in the entire industrialized world. If you look at the companies, the countries we compete against, Ireland has a corporate tax rate at 14%. England's at 17%. Canada's at 22%. France is at 16%. And we're at 35%. Under our bill, we bring that down to 21%. So we don't bring it down to the lowest, but to 21%. And by the way, H, when President Obama ran for re-election in 2012, he advocated bringing the corporate rate down to 25%, again, to get the economy going again. And so our bill does that, and this will help get the economy going again to get a growth rate up at 3 or 4%. That brings more money in so that we can spend on those things that we need to do.
Your soundbite from last August said you have to pay for the tax cut when you're $20 trillion in debt. And you've always said the debt is a big issue with you. If you look at Mark Zandi, chief economist of Moody's Analytics, tax cuts will swell the deficit by $1.1 trillion. You look at Eric Toder, the co-director of the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center. The annual lift to workers' pay will likely be $100. When the White House says $4,000. Ryan Bourne, economist at Cato Institute, the libertarian organization, predicts that tax reform will lift the average salary by $1,500 or so dollars, not the $4,000 that the White House projects. So regardless of where I looked, the tax reform is going to add to the national debt. Was that of concern to you? And you voted for this.
Yep.
So.
Well, I proudly voted for it. Yes, obviously adding to the national debt. I have 3 young kids, and adding debt onto them is not something that, is not something that we should be doing. However, but you got to think about this. There's 2 ways to control spending. One is you have to pass a budget where you control the line on spending. We passed a budget earlier this year that balances the budget over 10 years. But you got to have a growth rate that is up at 3 or 4%, so you're bringing more money in to pay down. Remember, the last time we had a growth rate at 4% was 1999-2000. Bill Clinton was president, Newt Gingrich was speaker. We had a growth rate at 4%. What happened? We brought our debt down to 0. We were at $7 trillion and we brought it down to 0. Under President Obama, we went from $8 trillion to $20 trillion. Way too much. Now, we had a financial crisis. We had 2 wars we were fighting. But my point is, you have to get a growth rate up at 3 or 4%. Our tax bill will do that. So there's no doubt going in debt $1.5 trillion is part of this tax bill. But the way that you counteract that is you control the line on spending, which we do and have done as a Republican Congress. But you got to have a growth rate where you bring down those corporate and business tax rates to get that going. And that has been, the example in the past that has worked to do that.
If you look back at Coolidge and Reagan and Bush 43, they had tax cuts, and their growth rates were not 4%. As a matter of fact, Coolidge actually, it was just a couple of years later that we had the Great Depression. Does it concern you that there's some historical background to tax cuts that didn't quite live up to what expectations were?
Yeah, but what was different back then is our corporate tax rate is so out of line with our competitors. If you look at the 30 countries we compete against worldwide, all of them have a corporate tax rate that is almost half of what ours is. So again, bringing it down to 21% is going to help us. The other thing is I talk to businesses in our community, small, medium, large business. So whether you're Caterpillar, whether you're Dot Foods in Mount Sterling, whether you're State Farm, John Deere, ADM, or lots of small businesses, and every one of them that I talked to said a tax cut will help our business. It will help with wages. It will help with hiring people. It will help with reinvesting into our community. Look at repatriation. We have $3 trillion that are parked overseas with corporations. And under our system, because of our high tax rate, we incentivize people to take that cash overseas, $3 trillion. Under our bill, we bring that money back to the United States. So if you're Apple, for instance, you have $400 billion parked overseas. Under our corporate tax rate, that money comes back. And where does that go? Again, goes into reinvesting in the United States. Caterpillar the same way. We have to get the economy going. We're not going to grow this economy with more government spending. You have to have the private sector flourishing. We believe having a growth rate at 3 or 4% is the way to do that. In the past, we've never had a growth rate that was 1.5 for 8 years straight. And that's essentially why we ended up $20 trillion in debt. So there is a little bit of a gamble or a risk here. But we have to do our job to hold the line on spending in Congress and also get the economy going again. If you look at this year, we're on track to have 3% growth in 2017. If we have 3 or 4% growth in 2018, which we're expected to do, and going into 2019, that's going to be good for the economy.
But Congressman, a Bank of America Merrill Lynch survey showed that 65% of the companies surveyed on a national basis said that they were going to use the benefits of the tax reform to pay down debt. Does that help contribute to the growth that we need to make sure that this tax reform remains revenue neutral?
Well, and I put this in an editorial that I just did last week, 137 economists, again, independent, nonpartisan economists came out and said, this will help the economy. This will help get growth going. And again, you look at, for instance, the Illinois Farm Bureau represents our farmers, 100% supportive of our tax bill. Look at the Chamber of Commerce, represents every small, medium, large business in our country, fully supportive of this bill. National Federation of Independent Business represents every Main Street business, whether they're in Peoria, Bloomington Normal, Springfield, Jacksonville, 100% supportive of this bill. So it may not be perfect in everybody's eyes. When I look at the bill and how it's going to help benefit people in central and west central Illinois. This is going to benefit the economy. It's going to benefit our job creators and get people back to work and get the economy healthy and vibrant again and moving forward. And there is no doubt moving forward, we have to hold the line on spending and continue to bring our debt down. But we need something that jumpstarts our economy.
Well, let's talk about holding the line on spending then. The president wanted a $54 billion increase in defense spending. The proposals that have been put forth were $700 billion for defense in total, $640 billion to run the Army, Navy, Marines, $60 billion for Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. That's a huge increase. That means the cuts elsewhere in entitlements, perchance, have to be even greater. Are you in favor of such a large increase in military spending, which, by the way, would be 7 times greater than Russia's military spending, which is the largest European expenditure of all those nations?
I think we need to keep our caps in place as it relates to defense spending. I think, again, everybody should be treated equally in our budget, and I don't think we should be putting the defense over that. Listen, I'm a strong supporter of our defense and our security apparatus, but it should be treated as other things in our budgetary process. And again, the only way you're going to hold the line on spending is you got to put caps, whether it's on defense or other agencies in the federal government, to hold the line on spending. We ought to be thinking always about how you bring down our debt in our country. And the only way you do that is making sure that everybody is treated equally there. And I think across the board, the caps that have been in place are sequestration. There are parts of our military that we need to fund and ramp up, but there are other parts that deserve cuts like everything else in government does.
So $700 billion is too much in your estimation?
I believe it is.
That turns the conversation to entitlement reform. The Speaker of the House, Mr. Ryan from Wisconsin, says we need to cut Medicare and Medicaid because that's where the big deficit is, that it helps contribute to the deficit. Mr. Trump, in campaigning, said, I'm not going to touch Medicare, I'm not going to touch Medicaid, I'm not going to touch Social Security. Where do you stand?
Well, first of all, anybody that is retired, that is receiving Medicare, none of their benefits are going to be touched or changed and shouldn't. However, I look at myself, I'm 49 years old. You look at the Medicare program, we always have to look at how we make government more effective, efficient, and accountable. And so how do we streamline Medicare for younger people so that it is available when I get to be of retirement age or younger people get to be retirement age? So entitlements have to change. The trajectory we're on with entitlements is they're going to be unsustainable. We cannot sustain what we're currently on right now. So means testing is a big part of that. And also reforming the Medicare and Medicaid system, I think, has to be a part of that. But if you're close to retirement or if you're retired, we shouldn't be thinking about touching that. But for the future, you have to do that. Medicaid, for instance, Medicaid has tripled since Bill Clinton has been president. There is about 1/3 of the babies born in Illinois are on Medicaid now. So Medicaid has exploded. Figuring out how you go in and make the system work more efficiently, get some of the waste, fraud, and abuse out of the system is important. That has to be part of what we do. So entitlement reform is a part of that. You are correct. President Trump ran on not touching these issues. One thing about President Trump is he's stuck with a lot of his campaign issues, and I think this will be one that he does that with. But when we talk about younger generations, we have to have some type of entitlement reform, and I'm in favor of doing that and figuring out the best approach as we move forward.
President Trump also ran on building a wall along the Mexican-American border. And he said recently that we're going to build the wall and we'll find money for it. And if Congress will find money for it, I'll support DACA. Are you agreeable to that philosophy where we're kind of trading wall for DACA?
Well, I've been critical of building a wall along the entire southern border. First of all, the cost of that is estimated to be $20 to $25 billion. I don't think that is something that's a wise use of our tax dollars. Plus, I don't think it's practical or efficient to do that. There are many portions of our southern border that are owned by private property owners that don't want a wall. There's natural barriers along there. However, I do agree that there are secured fencing, there are barriers, there are things that can be put up along portions of the border that will help deter illegal immigration. We have to enforce our law. And so I'm in favor of money and resources that help with those things along the wall to stop people from coming across illegally. How DACA is tied in with that is going to be an important thing. March 5th is our deadline when DACA expires, and we have to figure out a way. The president's even said, he talked in glowing terms about the dreamers that are here in this country and what we have to do. Through no fault of their own, they were brought into this country, and almost all of them have served our country well, have gotten an education. Some have gone in the military. The ones that have engaged in criminal activity need to be sent back to their country of origin. We can't tolerate criminals in this country. So it's a complicated issue. However, we have to figure out a fix to DACA, and I think some of those things along our southern border, securing the southern border and making sure we are deterring illegals from coming across has to be part of it. And by the way, illegal crossings on the border are down about 60% since President Trump has come in. Part of that is due to the rhetoric, the support of the Border Patrol, more resources along there, but we have to continue to do that. I think there'll be broad support in Congress of figuring out a solution for DACA as it relates to the border.
And by the way, DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, young people who came to America. And in fact, many of them know nothing but America. They came at such a young age. Another portion of President Trump's request is 10,000 additional immigration people to help control the border. Is that better use of funding rather than building a wall that people could go under, over, around?
Yeah, well, I want to know the cost on what that is going to be to the federal budget. But again, I go back to I don't think a wall is going to be the answer to solve our immigration problems. The other part of this that I think will be part of our immigration discussion is legal immigration. Right now, we let in about 1.1, 1.2 legal immigrants a year. Our legal immigration system has worked fairly well, but we need to streamline that. We need to make that a more efficient system. Right now, it takes way too long to legally immigrate to this country, anywhere from 2 to 4 years. How we change that to make that 1 year or a year and a half, I think is something that we need to do. Legal immigrants to this country are folks that go back to their country of origin, go through a background check, pay a fee to come here, take a test, and they end up being some of our best citizens. I participate routinely in naturalization services throughout my district. They end up being our best citizens, and so I'm very supportive of legal immigration reform, again, along with coming up with a solution along the border, and again, keeping people that want to harm America out of the country.
Stopgap funding occurred December 6th, I believe, then again December the 22nd or 21st. Now we're facing a deadline of January 19. This is no way to run a boat. What do we need to, what hurdles do we need to get over in order to get a budget put together so that states, organizations don't sit there with, well, I got a month that with CHIP funding or whatever, I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Well, it's been probably one of the most frustrating things in my 2 years in Congress is constantly coming up to a fiscal cliff, or the government's going to shut down, or we're going to fund the government for a month at a time or 6 months at a time. It's no way to run a government or any operation. And it's been very, very frustrating. I voted against a number of continuing resolutions because just on principle, I don't think it's the way that you fund government. The last thing we should be thinking about is shutting down the government. There are grave consequences to our country, to our military, to our security in shutting down the government. But on the other thing is, we haven't been able to come to an agreement with Democrats in a bipartisan way on how you fund the government over a year period of time. In the House last year, very proud that the House of Representatives passed all 12 appropriations bills. First time that's been done since 1996. We did that. We sent them over to the Senate. The Senate didn't do anything. They sat on them. So, that is frustrating. We feel like we did our job in terms of passing those 12 appropriations. And those, by the way, those 12 appropriations bills, they fund every sector of the government. And many of those bills were passed in a bipartisan way. So, It is an unfortunate part of our system that we haven't been able to reach this. We should never be using the leverage of shutting down the government to function, and so that has to change.
I mentioned CHIP, a children's health insurance program. March 5th, I think, is the deadline for that. It started back in 1997, and every couple of years, Congress says, okay, here's a little bit more money, here's some. Is CHIP going to continue past March 5? The states need to know, they need to plan.
Yeah. I've been very supportive of the CHIP program. I will continue to be supportive of it. I've voted for it in the past. Again, this is one of the consequences of doing short-term continuing resolutions. The CHIP program has worked well and will maintain itself. And what I anticipate, we will pass either a 2-year authorization or a 5-year authorization of the CHIP program, and we'll do that by the March deadline.
One of the sad features we have to discuss is sexual harassment in Congress. There appears to be a secret fund that's paid by the Treasury Department, taxpayer money, quite often without the name of the offender listed, to cover, to hush sexual harassment charges brought against members of Congress. What's going on with a secret fund? I don't think Americans appreciate this.
No, and they shouldn't. We need to have full transparency. When we talk about taxpayer money, up to $16 million, as you referenced, there needs to be sunlight shed on that. That's the best disinfectant for government, and it's appalling that was done. That practice has been changed, and it should have been changed. I've been very outspoken on a number of my own colleagues in the Republican Party asking for their resignation, whether it was on Roy Moore or Blake Farenthold, the Republican from Texas, as well as Democrats on the other side. There is no place in politics and entertainment or in business for this type of activity to go on. Sexual harassment and the allegations that people have engaged in need to be stopped. We need to raise awareness on it. We need to hold people responsible. And anybody that serves the public and engages in this type of activity needs to be either leave, resign, or be defeated.
We accept viewer questions through the internet, and one came in from an individual named Braden. How do you feel about the split in the GOP with Steve Bannon's war on the establishment?
Well, listen, we had an election in Alabama. I was very vocal about the allegations against Roy Moore, and in the end, he lost that. The voters in Alabama did not elect him because of those allegations. Steve Bannon supported him. I don't know Steve Bannon. I've never spent any time with Steve Bannon. I worry about my own district and the people that I represent and what I view as our Republican Party, which is the party of opportunity, the party of inclusiveness, party of conservative values, of fiscal responsibility, smaller government, standing up for the Constitution. Those are things that I stand for as a Republican and that I advocate for. I don't get into these other issues of personalities in our Republican Party. I look forward to helping other Republican candidates and being engaged with a party that stands for those principles that I think have made us the party that we have today.
We have not addressed international issues, so let's talk about a recent decision by President Trump to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in 6 months. Ostensibly that the embassy will be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Do you support that particular decision?
I have concerns about that. Now, on the one hand, I give the president credit. He ran on this issue. This was an issue he talked about in the campaign. If I'm elected, I'm going to do this. And he's made a decision to do that. People have to remember, Jerusalem is an international city. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like what the Vatican is in Italy. And Jerusalem is a very important city for religious purposes, historical purposes, and cultural purposes for Jews and Christians and Muslims. And I'm supportive of the two-state solution in Israel. Figuring out how we come up with a two-state solution. That's something that, President Bush supported, and many others on the Republican side have supported. So I don't think the approach of saying we're going to move that, our embassy to Jerusalem, I don't think the timing is right on doing that. I wish we had waited. I think that needs to be a negotiated part of the two-state solution between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I continue to be a strong supporter of Israel. They're our ally there. I don't think this is the best move to help with that two-state solution and negotiating a peace in the Middle East.
So many issues, so little time. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we want to say thank you to Congressman Darren LaHood of the 18th Congressional District. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, H.
And please join us next time on At Issue when we're going to be talking about going to court. No, not the court you're used to. There are specialty courts in many, many counties. There's courts for drugs, there's courts for veterans, there's courts for a lot of different types of issues that help people get back on the straight and narrow. We'll talk about those specialty courts next time on At Issue.